Welcome back to the third movie that we're going to be talking about in this franchise. It is X-Men: The Last Stand. This film is unfortunately not directed by Bryan Singer this time. This film was directed by Brett Ratner. And what public discourse will tell you about this movie is that it's one of the worst comic book movies made. It's an abomination of a film. It should have never been made. And while some of that stuff is true, I think Bryan Singer would have made a way better film. We're going to talk about my feelings towards this movie. Because you see, I'm a very big X-Men fanatic, and I kind of look at things a little bit through rose-tinted glasses. So when I watched this movie, did I feel a certain way? Yes, I did. I thought the movie was pretty bad in a lot of parts, but there was still some good to be shown in this movie too. I will say at the start of the movie, it is a little bit of a jarring kind of opening. Like, we first talked about the first two movies that had really, really great openings for the story, and this movie kind of has two weird openings to it. For starters, the first scene says it's 20 years earlier, and we see Ian McKellen as Magneto, and we see Charles de-aged, so they look younger. And this was weird for the mid-2000s to kind of do. It looks as good as you think it would. But also, the continuity with this seems a little off. They're both on their way to kind of recruiting new X-Men, basically. New people to be sent to Charles' mansion to kind of, hide away and kind of, contain their powers. But this time, they are meeting Jean Grey, who is classified in this as a level 5 mutant, which we didn't really talk about before this movie. If you're unfamiliar with this, the story kind of tells you as it goes along, but the basics of it is that there's like classes of mutants, level 1s being like kind of like people that have mutant powers, but it's not really something to be like spooked about. It's not, one of those like overly gigantic powers that Jean Grey does possess, or somebody like a Magneto even. Although Magneto isn't even technically level 5, he's lower than that. He's less powerful than Jean. So the levels of, people, it's almost like the social class, the economic class, except for mutants and their powers. So the scene is a little jarring in that sense, but then it jumps forward 10 years. So now it says 10 years ago, and we see a much better opening in my opinion. We see a little kid kind of mutilating his body because he's a little deformed on his back. We see that the father barges into the bathroom after he's said he'd been in there for an hour. You see a bunch of blood, and you see a bunch of utensils like with scissors and like cheese graters and stuff like that. Anything to kind of like manipulate and mutilate this kid's body because he doesn't want to disappoint this guy, because he is one of the governors that is making one of the things that is the big antagonist of this movie. It's pretty dark, it's pretty gritty. I actually like this opening compared to the beginning portion of the opening. It kind of just shows like the level of like people will go to because they are afraid of mutants, and the discrimination against it is so high that even a child at like the age of like between 10 to like 13 years old will go as far as to like ruin his own body almost to hide the fact that he even is a mutant to his father. But then what gets even weirder is the rest of the opening of the movie, because then it does a bunch of title cards, and then we see it say, in the not too distant future. What? Like, I don't really understand why it had to say that. It could have just said present day, to be honest. It didn't have to say not too distant future, but there's some elements in this scene that I do like. We see the X-Men kind of training in the Danger Room, which is the first time we actually end up seeing this, and it's a fun little scene for moments, but then there's also other things that is not so great about it. Everything is just kind of casual for a little bit. It's not really like felt like it's a life or death situation, even though it's presented as such. But the major part of this portion of the story is it plants the seeds of the Rogue, Kitty Pryde, and Bobby sort of love triangle. And that stuff is just nah. It just feels unnecessary, because you had the first movie kind of sets it up slightly, and then the second movie really develops this relationship. And now it's just kind of like, oh, let's throw in Kitty Pryde, I guess, who actually was played by 3 different people, I believe. At least 2. Because Elliot Page is Kitty Pryde for the remainder of the series, but in the first 2 movies is played by 2 different people, actually, if you look it up on IMDb. It's kind of weird. Oh, and if you needed more of a sassy Logan, here's the counter for this one.
We're getting killed out here.
Yeah, I know. They're not ready, Storm.
Logan? Logan?
Oh, don't get your panties in a bunch. That was my last cigar.
Be on the lookout for this. He gets real sassy in this movie. I do like parts of this at the end of it, like Logan kind of takes matters into his own hands and kind of says that the kids aren't ready for any of the situations that's being thrown at them in the danger room. So he basically ends the simulation, and, you know, him and Storm kind of get into a fight a little bit about it. And he just mentions that he's just the sub and you need to talk to Scott if you have a real issue. There's even more great tension between Scott and Logan in this scene too. We see that Scott is being tormented by the death of Jean Grey, and because of this, Logan feels that he needs to step in and talk to Scott a little bit about it. He needs to let him know that we all kind of need to get over this because she's gone, and we understand that she meant a lot, but like she's not with us anymore, which leads to this great line where Scott ends up saying, "Not everybody heals as fast as you," which is funny because when you look at the remainder of the series and you see way more stuff that's going to be happening to Logan in his past life and the future now, it's kind of like crazy for him to say that because like Logan has gone through some serious shit. So it's just funny, kind of like an Easter egg, like for those that have watched all the movies, it's like, yeah, Logan like understands like the concept of death and life, like way more than probably Scott ever did. This then leads to some fun moments where we get to meet a couple of new characters, one of them being Kelsey Grammer playing Beast, or Hank McCoy. This is still the great era of the practical effects because he looks awesome in this role, and I do genuinely love it. And spoiler alerts for the Marvels, they did the full CGI face and everything for Beast at the end of the Marvels. So Kelsey Grammer also played him in that one. So it's kind of a cool way to see both versions of it. But this one, for, again, as early on as this movie was in the mid-2000s, it's really cool to see because, again, you get this and then you get Mystique as well. There's another little fun scene with Mystique as she kind of transforms and is interrogated by this. Basically, Beast is one of the ambassadors at the White House who are now talking about the main conflict in this movie, or at least one of them, about the cure for mutant kind. This is brought up because Beast ends up returning back to the mansion where he talks to Charles and Storm about this mutant cure, where we see a lot of people have polarizing sort of rationales behind this. Because those that are completely comfortable in their skin and like being a mutant and the things that they do, let's say as Storm does, there are those like Rogue who can't even touch anybody without essentially killing them, and it might be more intriguing for those. So it's a great kind of dynamic that puts mutants against each other that is also then having the government finance it. So everyone just kind of still kind of filters in with one another and kind of is still infighting for the most part. Oh, and if you need more Logan sassiness, this scene's got plenty of it too. But the sass isn't, left out just to Logan. I mean, look at this guy at the, truck with him talking to Mystique at one point. He gets it pretty good, too. I will say some more nitpicks that I have at this portion of the movie. If you think that there isn't enough stuff going on in this movie, there's a lot more that ends up does happening. There's a point in this movie where Beast ends up meeting the child that they are using the DNA to make this cure for, and there's a little nice scene where Kelsey Grammer starts to walk up and shake his hand, and his hand starts to turn into like a normal hand, and he's like stunned by this because obviously the kid can suppress any of the mutant powers. It's a fun little scene, but the fact that it ends as short as it does is a little annoying to me. And you thought that was interesting and that's like, oh, the driving force of this movie. Well, fear not, because you've got even more stuff that happens in this. So the next couple of scenes that we see is Jean Grey finally getting back into the fold of this movie. We see Scott go and ride off at the Alkali Lake, and he kind of has a, sort of meltdown for a moment because all he hears is Jean Grey's voice. He lasers the water, and thus Jean Grey appears. And I will say, Famke Janssen, really great actor here, and I think that there are moments in this movie that are genuinely great for her, and the beginnings of this kind of show it. However, I will say that the cool parts of this where you see Jean kind of being like, I'm here, I'm alive, nice to see you, I want to see your eyes. And then Scott's like, "Oh, what, do you want to see my eyes? I mean, you can see them through the red. Like, I can't take these off because, you know, lasers." But then she kind of lets him know that, no, I could suppress your power. I want to see your real eyes. So then they have a little bit of a moment, and that's kind of cool. And then this fucker dies off screen. So, yes, as we discussed in the previous two movies, and like the James Marsden stock as Scott Summers went from pretty okay to like not great to like, yeah, he's just out of the movie within like the first, I don't know, 30 minutes of the movie. He's dead, he's killed off screen, and then we see that Charles now tells Logan and Storm to go to Alkali Lake to find out what happened to him, where they stumble upon Jean Grey's body there. There's some fun stuff here with all the debris kind of like floating around after the death of Scott Summers. It's just kind of like the wreckage almost of it. Her powers are still kind of like making everything kind of float. And this is the part where we get the explanation of how Jean is even alive at this point. Basically, Charles says is that she had her powers wrap her up in almost a cocoon of telekinetic energy that saved her from the water that was going to kill her when she rose the ship at Alkali Lake. A little weird, but apparently it's also comic accurate, so you can't really get too mad at this. But what you get out of this, and a little bit more good character development out of these characters, is that you find out that Charles Xavier was blocking a lot of this Phoenix Force that they labeled it as, with her exponential power in her mind, because it was so powerful and so chaotic that Charles was like, yeah, we're just going to block that part off and she'll figure it out later on in life when she has better control of her powers, which then sparks this moral discussion between, you know, Charles and Wolverine, which, you know, I don't know. I just like that their dynamic here, to be honest with you. I think their back and forth is always really good in this movies. And the fact that it's with Jean and how much they both care for each other, but in different ways, it kind of shows a little bit more here. Other moments that I find kind of fun in this movie happen after this, where Magneto ends up getting Mystique from the truck that is now transporting a bunch of different mutants. There's a fun moment in here because as they're kind of getting a bunch of different mutants to kind of join the Brotherhood, as he's called it, but we see that Mystique ends up taking a bullet, rather the cure, for Magneto, because one of the cops that they missed out on shoots him. But then Mystique ends up getting the cure, and now she is done being Mystique. She is now back to being Raven. It was an interesting scene because then you see Magneto look at her as her normal self and basically tells her off and goes, "You're not one of us anymore." And you even hear him say at the end of it, saying that she was so beautiful, really hammering home that he loved her way more as her mutation rather than just generic old regular Raven. It's a nice touch, at least for Magneto in that sense, but it's also like, damn, you're just gonna leave her there all naked and stuff. You're not even gonna throw her like your cape. That would have been a little bit gentlemanly. We then revert back to the mansion, where we then get Logan and Jean kind of having a one-on-one conversation a little bit. So Jean and Logan kind of go at it like, you know, rabid, you know, squirrels, and like it's a really intense moment, at least for the two of them. But then it kind of gets reverted back into the story where Jean ends up telling off Logan on how that Charles has basically tamed him and is controlling him all the time, which prompts then Logan to be like, okay, but like, where's Scott? Jean kind of has a meltdown, and you get to see a little bit at this point of what she's capable of, like in real time. All the technology is flickering, all the stuff is moving around. Logan ends up trying to calm her down and telling her that the professor can fix it, while she's constantly saying, you need to kill me. Before I hurt anybody else, you need to just kill me. Once he states that the professor can fix it, her eyes end up going black and saying that I don't want to fix it, shoves him out the way, and then she's out of the mansion. This leads to a really great scene in a lot of parts here, because then we see Charles and Magneto bring along their sidekicks to Jean Grey's old house, where they first met her at the beginning of the movie. So Storm and Logan are kind of told to stay outside of the house, whereas Magneto tells his group of people to stay at the front of the house and don't let anybody in. I love it more so because of the fact that Jean is just sitting there in a chair in the living room that they were in, and it's almost presented like an exorcism. Like her skin is kind of starting to turn all like deathly tan, and her eyes are kind of blackening, and, you know, singular chairs sitting there and everything's floating around her as they're both walking and talking to her. I just love the presentation of this scene. This then leads to a small fight, and some of the action here is like shot okay, and then there's other action scenes in this sort of whole entire movie that just don't really move me whatsoever. Like, I like parts of this, like some of the fights with Juggernaut and Logan is pretty cool, but then you have the stuff fighting between Storm and then the Speedster girl, and that's just kind of meh. But the ending of this sequence is actually pretty good because we see Jean basically go full sort of Phoenix mode and completely eviscerate Charles Xavier. He's gone. Poof. Bottle of dust. Just out of here. Out of mind. Again, what I'm not a big fan of after this scene, though, because it's a really touching scene. It's kind of moving because obviously you understand Charles Xavier. You've been with him now for 2.5 films. You understand his intentions and motives, and now it's one of the major characters in the story now gone. How they follow this up is not something that I would do, because they end up having the funeral, which is nice, and they show, everyone there kind of, praying over Charles. We then get to see Bobby kind of go on a mini date with Kitty Pryde, and it's kind of like weird because he ends up making the fountain into an ice rink, and it's like, okay, you know what you're doing though, dude, right? Like, you have Rogue as like a chick, and like you're just kind of doing this just out of the kindness of your heart, and she watches from the top of like her tower, basically. It's kind of like, the evil stepmother watching over somebody. It's just really weird, and like, again, the whole, this portion of the movie is just bogged down for the most part. I don't like this part of the movie at all. But this leads to some more stuff that I enjoyed with the movie, mostly between Rogue and Logan throughout the entire trilogy that this is, because they had to have one more conversation where she ends up trying to storm off out of the mansion and saying that she wants to get the cure because, Logan, you are not understanding how I feel about my powers, because I can't even, hold someone's hand. I can't even touch anybody. I can't even kiss anybody without basically murdering them. And Logan just kind of tells her, like, you shouldn't do this just for a boy. If you're going to do it, just make sure that it's for you, not for somebody else. Which prompts the great kind of call and response where Rogue says, shouldn't you be telling me not to do this? And then Logan just basically goes, I'm not your father, I'm your friend. So just think about what you're doing before you end up doing it. And again, this is the last time they'll ever do anything with each other, so it's like kind of cool. And then like when you think about the rest of these movies, it goes, that's it? Really? Okay, I guess it's done. This then leads to another really fun scene that I enjoy. We have Logan kind of storming off into the forest to go ahead and find Jean Grey. There's a really intense fight scene here. It's one of the better fight scenes in this movie, where he fights off a couple different mutants, and then he also stumbles upon Magneto's eventual plan for the rest of the movie. He's going to find the laboratory that is making this cure, and he's going to basically destroy it and destroy any remnants of it for mutant kind. Yeah! There's also some nitpick moments in this part of the movie too, though, because there's a part where Pyro kind of takes an offhanded comment about Charles Xavier and basically says that I would have done exactly what Jean did if you would have given me the chance. And then Magneto just kind of goes, Charles Xavier did more for mutant kind than you will ever know. And it's like, bro, why are you so pressed by this? Like, he goes on to say, like, I just hate that, like, he died not by my hands. And it's like, okay, and this then leads to the big finale of the movie, and I put this in air quotes just because you want it to feel very powerful, but it's not. Because, as you see, this movie has the same problems as, I would say, Spider-Man 3 has, and introduces so many different concepts and so many different things that it's all just like kind of wrestling to like even get a spotlight. You have the mini subplot of Rogue, Bobby, and Kitty. You have the main subplot of Jean Grey, and she's back and she's the Phoenix Force. You have the cure, which is the government against mutants. You have Magneto trying to destroy the cure and to get mutants against each other, which then prompts the X-Men to come in and attack Magneto in this instance. So there's so much going on, and everything is rustling for like the spotlight. And it also doesn't work because the movie's an hour and 45 minutes as well. So the fact that this movie is like as short as it's as short as the first movie, and the first movie is way more streamlined than this was. There is some funny moments in here too that I will say that I enjoyed. I mean, they had Beast kind of finally have a couple of moments here where like he gets to fight, and it is kind of funny to watch because he's just like kind of flying around clearly on cables and stuff. I just find it funny. Oh, but there's some more sass for Wolverine right here. And the sass is off the chain. Actually, if you think about it, it's so off the chain that even Juggernaut has something to say too about this. I will say, though, there is another element in this scene that kind of pays off in an instance, at least from the second movie. After rewatching, I didn't really like it as much, but like the Iceman and Pyro fight that ends up happening in this scene, at least I thought it was cool when I was like 10. But actually, one of my favorite moments towards the end of this movie that I really enjoyed was Magneto's fate. Because what ends up happening is that they defeat Magneto by injecting him with the cure. It's almost like a poetic ending for him because he is so much justifying mutant kind and all this other stuff. And for him just to be turned into one of them, as they call it, is just beautiful in an instance. But what I don't like is that they basically just have Jean kind of pushed off to the side for a while. Like, once Jean kind of goes with Magneto and is like his pawn basically in this plan that they have, she really doesn't get to do anything up until this very moment in the movie. She ends up Thanosing everybody away and everyone turns into like dust and the building is getting wrecked and stuff like that. And they're all trying to move each other away. But like, the part that I don't like about this instant is that you get a zoom up on Magneto and he just goes, "What have I done?" "It's your fault! It's your fault!" So the ending of this movie ends up having Logan kill Jean, and it is a touching moment partially here, but, you know, there are other, you know, parts of this that it's just like, it's not as earned as I wish it was. I don't know. I just like, it's Hugh Jackman was trying so hard in this movie to make it as good as it was, and it just was not it for this one. The movie ends with Beast once again becoming the ambassador for mutants and humans, so now he's in political power and hopefully kind of helping everyone kind of be like, mutants are okay. And you get this weird shot at the end of the movie where like Logan kind of steps out the mansion and he goes, "Huh, what a great job we did," and it kind of does a weird zoom out, and I'm like, this isn't like an 80s comedy. Well, maybe it is, I don't know. But then they do add 2 post-credit scenes basically here where we have Magneto playing chess by himself in a park, and just like any sort of medicine, when they tell you the 99.9% kills germs, that's how this cure works, because we see one of the chess pieces move slightly with Magneto using his powers. Which is fine, because, you know, it's kind of explained later on that, you know, that kind of stuff just kind of withers away. It's not a foolproof cure, obviously. It's the first of its kind. But what I also don't like here is the continuity stuff that they're going to be making here with Charles Xavier. Because we see that Charles Xavier kind of blew up into smithereens, basically, from Jean earlier. But because he had a twin brother who is under care in like a cancer state, he ended up shooting his mind, his consciousness from his body to his twin brother's body. So now he inhabits that body, and he is now Charles Xavier once again. And it's a really weird thing. It's never expanded on in any of these movies. I had to find that out from other people and read really into it because it's like a comic book thing or whatever. So like the fact that this had to be like talked about like on the internet and explained in the internet just shows that like how much of a dog shit moment this kind of was. In the end, the movie's kind of whack. Like, it's not the greatest movie in the world, but I don't think it's like one of the worst comic book movies in the world. It's certainly better than like something like Batman v Superman, at least for my taste. There's just way too much stuff crammed in this story for it to even be like a good length and kind of just like, oh, we're gonna do this and this and this and it's gonna be all fun and dandy. No, it's just kind of like a hodgepodge of a mess, really, to be honest with you. Some characters get some cool moments to shine, like Logan does. Storm ends up having some good moments because she ends up taking over the mantle of Charles Xavier for the mansion at this point. But alas, my closing thoughts on this really would be that it only gets worse from here. And that's not a great sign. I'm going to give X-Men The Last Stand 2.5 stars. So we completed the first trilogy of the X-Men franchise. Let me know what your favorite of the first 3 are. Buckle up, folks, because next week we're going to be talking about X-Men Origins Wolverine. We'll see how much my love for this character kind of, you know, blocks out all the negative in this movie. You'll just have to find out. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you all next time.